All right, welcome to another Sunday Conversation presented by FingerLakes1.com. I'm Josh Durso, and I'm joined today by Peter Mantius. He is the founder of the Waterfront Online. It's a digital publication dedicated to environmental issues, talking about environmental news. Peter, thanks for being here again. Boy, this is probably like the fourth or fifth time in the year.
So great to be here.
Let's talk about the most recent story you published. A little bit of confusion, I guess, because that was the way it felt to me. As I'm reading through this story about these toxins that have been tested for across the state, is there some sort of withholding that's happening? That appears to be what the story was getting at.
Well, this is relatively, I don't want to say new class of chemicals because they've been around for actually decades, but the emphasis on trying to figure out how dangerous they are and where they are has really kind of blown up in the last few years. Now, particularly since the Department of Defense a couple of years ago looked at 664 military sites around the country. Pretty much anybody suspected of using this firefighting foam. And that really set off a lot of alarms. Now, in New York State, it was, of course, the town of Hoosick Falls near Albany, where they found it in the public water supply. That's what really got things ignited here. But it's always been a public relations issue with the state government, because if this is found in public water supplies, it's a huge issue. And so I think that the state officials really want to know where it is and how serious the problem is. At the same time, they want to try to control any kind of public reaction to it. So in the case of Hoosick Falls, that situation was uncovered by a guy who was concerned about his father's death from cancer, and he personally tested the water there, found PFAS in the water supply. But the local officials and state officials were not eager to start making a big fuss about this and letting the public know right away. It really took the intervention of the federal EPA, the Obama EPA, and it's important to say that because the Trump EPA is now backing off. But the Obama EPA ordered the local officials to tell people that, hey, your public water is not safe to drink. And I think now what we have is the DEC, and I think the Department of Health is also part of this. They are really trying to look around the state to see where there might be other possible problems. But they're not telling anybody where the sites are that they've tested, let alone what the results of those tests are. So we don't know whether there are 20 or 30 or no places that have really dangerous levels of PFCs in their public water supply.
So the basic question, you touched on it a little bit, the PR side of this, or the PR challenge associated with this for the state, is that, you think, the core why, or answer to the question why this information or the data would be getting withheld, or at least sort of jumbled up in a bureaucratic process?
Well, I can't think why else. I think that the public agencies have to balance doing their job, trying to protect the environment, with creating a huge problem for the governor and for the administration. Suppose it's found in 50 places around the state. What are they going to do? Are they going to tell everybody you can't drink your public water? It's a public relations challenge, and so I think they're trying to balance that.
I think it also creates a little bit of a technological challenge, given that perhaps part of the reason could be that they just don't know how to deal with this if they were to try and deal with this.
And which sites do you test? Mm-hmm. They put out a survey of possible sites that might have PFAS contamination, and they received roughly 900 responses, and of that they chose to look at 140 sites based on how far they were away from public water sources and private wells. But is that as deep as you need to go?
Right.
and there, of course, there's no public input as to who, where do they test. There's no, as far as I know, no public input into that decision. That which 940 sites out of the 900 are you going to test? So I think we'll learn more, and I have a Freedom of Information request in to get those 140 sites and to get the data. Certainly for the Finger Lakes at least, maybe not the whole state.
So obviously, folks have probably spotted some of those keywords that we've been talking about for the last couple minutes with some of your other reporting. Specifically, you mentioned the depot. How does this sort of connect back to, or how is this issue related to the story that you published about the Seneca Army Depot a couple months ago? Some of the folks might be connecting the two.
Well, sure, because as I mentioned a minute ago, the Department of Defense did a test at 664 military sites around the country. I think most of that was done in 2016 and 17, but the report on the Seneca Army Depot came out in 17, and it found very, very high levels of PFAS, two specific chemicals in that family, at 3 different places on the depot site, and one of them in particular was extremely high. So now the question is, because this is in groundwater, there will be plumes created from that contamination, and the question is, what is the shape and the direction of that plume, and what wells are going to be affected? Now, most of the people who are drinking water around there are getting it from public sources that are probably not going to be affected, but any kind of private wells could possibly be affected. Now, the Department of Health has apparently done some testing and said that I think I've read that they did 22 private wells in that area and found that none showed contamination over the EPA's limit.
Guided limits. Okay.
So
my question then becomes, what, if anything, have we heard from local officials in the Finger Lakes regarding either the state portion of this or just the concern, the community concern that I would imagine exists in the Finger Lakes when you're talking about a region that really depends and relies on fresh, clean water?
I don't think there's been a big alarm about this at all among local officials there. I haven't seen it. Now I need to start calling people and asking them specifically, have you been tested? Did the state require you to do tests because of some facility in your area? So it's been kind of quiet. Now, Seneca Lake Guardian has written the Department of Health and said, and they wrote a letter that the DOH has not responded to. It was March 1st they wrote the letter, and they basically are saying, give us an update on this plume that is headed towards Seneca Lake. Now, it may never reach Seneca Lake. Nobody knows how extensive it is, but they want an update because it might. And they're not getting that update at this point.
And is when you look at this and when you obviously follow the reporting as you have, at what point do you sort of wonder, well, the clock's ticking, people need to start talking about this, there needs to be more action, especially from local officials who I would imagine would have to be the advocates for their local individual bodies of water that they want to protect, right?
I don't think we're going to get a press release from the Department of Health or the DEC saying, we've found this in, X number of towns around upstate New York. I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's going to be individual situations popping up because somebody learns of some test that was way beyond the health advisory limits. I think it's going to be more one place at a time. We'll see, though. I mean, maybe the governor has a totally different plan for this and is going to make a big announcement about here's where the problems are.
What are obviously you've been looking into this for several months now. Well, what are your expectations for the next couple months heading into the summer?
On that issue, I'm really hoping that I get an answer to my Freedom of Information request. Unfortunately, you can't count on it. You don't know whether it's going to be weeks or months, and then when you get the answer, you don't know how limited it's going to be. It's a little bit like the Mueller report. You know, we don't quite know what's going to happen. But there's a really high probability that I'm not going to get all the information I asked for quickly.
Another interesting story that you published, I believe, on the 12th, if I'm not mistaken, we have a new lawsuit, and it has to do with landfills. Fill us in there, and we'll talk a little bit about what this means for the region as a whole.
All right, it's the Hakes landfill, which is a few miles northwest of Corning. It's owned by Casella and operated by Casella. And they're looking to expand, and it's actually in the little town of Campbell. Mm-hmm. And Campbell is also named as a defendant in the suit because there's a zoning case that is associated with this potential expansion of the landfill. And the lawsuit basically is challenging the DEC and its review of radioactivity in the leachate, and also the monitors that they have at the gate of the landfill to test whether radioactivity is coming into the property. In both cases, the Sierra Club and others who are challenging the DEC on this are saying that the state never took a, quote, hard look at either of those issues, at is there radioactivity or evidence of radioactivity in the leachate, and are these monitors effective? The hard look is, quote unquote, part of the law. The regulators have to take a hard look at whether, a whole bunch of environmental issues that they must consider seriously. And Sierra Club is saying, you just missed this, mm-hmm. and we want you to go back and take another look at it. That sounds like legal speak to some degree. What is a hard look? What is that, as subjective as it might sound to a casual listener right now? Well, I mean, that's what gets litigated is what is a hard look? Mm-hmm. I mean, there is no absolute definition of it. The courts define it. So we are seeing an increased number of these sort of stories popping up about what is going into local landfills. We have the Ontario County landfill, Seneca Meadows landfill, you got the Hakes landfill. What is this? Does it appear as though the state is taking any of these issues more seriously than they were maybe 5 or 10 years ago, when it seems like maybe there wasn't quite as strict oversight of what was going in, what's going out, what kind of testing is happening? Because that seems to be, if you take a temperature now, that seems to be where we are, where there's a little bit of catch-up happening now, and it's because of a lot of community-based groups. Well, I mean, I think that handling waste is always in flux. And, quite a while ago, there were unregulated dumps all over the state. Right. And the big move that the state made was let's consolidate these into a few really large landfills. And now that we have the really large landfills, there's a question of, what goes in the landfills? And for the people that are exporting the waste, like New York City, how much does it cost to send it to the landfills? How much do we send out of state? Issues about whether or not you're going to segregate out food products and things like that, which is a hot issue right now, even in the legislature. All these things it's all in flux. Mm-hmm. And right now the state is trying to figure out what its plan is for the next 10 years for handling waste. And they've had a number of hearings around the state to try to get public input about where should we go from here. Do we want to have more incinerators? Do we want to have more landfills? Do we want to export it to other states? We have to do something with it. Mm-hmm. And so they're trying to figure out what is the right course. And I'm wondering what you think the obligation is of individual communities and towns as we start to see them named in more, obviously in more lawsuits, more Article 78s, and that where
they might have gone through the process saying, well, the DEC is doing their due diligence, the business that's working with us is doing their due diligence. There isn't a lot for us to do. We're not experts on landfilling. Is this sort of a wake-up call for them?
Well, I think as you have issues like the stink, the smell, and that seems to be a problem next to an awful lot of landfills. I think you're really getting the community engaged. I mean, that's something that gets everybody's attention. And obviously it has up here in Geneva, in the Geneva area. And I think you're seeing a lot more input from the communities themselves.
Right.
But I made an issue out of the fact that when the DEC set up these hearings around the state, they didn't have one in Geneva, which is sort of the heart of where these big landfills are and where the stink is. And why not hold a hearing where they have the biggest problem?
Right.
So.
And it does feel like a cop-out, if nothing else. So another landfill-ish related issue, you've done an incredible amount of coverage. We've been on another radio show talking about it. The digester in Cuyahoga County. Let everybody know where that stands right now versus where it did about a month or a month and a half ago when that story was really starting to pop up.
Well, I wrote a story quoting the former manager of the digester as saying that he left in January because he felt he was being pressured to take waste that was not appropriate for the digester. The digester is supposed to take manure and food products and things related to food products, right. Mostly manure though. And then what it's supposed to do is generate a modest amount of electricity from the methane that comes from that. So anyway, this former manager, a man named John Rosser, quit as the manager of this digester. He's saying, I'm being forced to take things that don't belong in that digester. And shortly after that, well, no, actually several weeks after that, the DEC did a surprise investigation of the site. And then a little bit after that, a couple weeks after that, they came out with a report and said the digester may no longer accept any shipments from a recycling center in the Bronx and source separated organics from the New York City Department of Sanitation. Just a blanket, you can't take anymore until you give us more information about what this stuff is. Now, that the DEC order specified that the source that you can't take it from, but it never really dealt with, well, how is it getting there? So we don't really know exactly who is transporting this material there, and that's something that's going to require some more reporting.
So then, obviously, I want to talk a little bit about the community reaction to that one, because that really seemed to embody the grassroots nature of how this tends to start to bubble up. That started with neighbors, right? Neighbors starting to complain, right. Starting a Facebook group, that kind of thing? Right.
Well, associated with the digester, not far away, is a new manure pond. And it takes the effluent that comes out of the digester, and it mixes, it's manure and it's stuff that comes out of the digester. And a neighbor of the manure pond was very concerned about the type of material that was going in that and whether it was meeting the permits, the requirements of the permits for it. So the manure lagoon, I think, is what triggered a lot of this, but also I think some of the employees at the digester also triggered it because they were saying, they were being asked to fish through piles of garbage and pull out all sorts of stuff that clearly didn't belong in the digester.
Can local residents take a little bit of solace in the fact that the DEC did investigate and seemed to, after the complaints started rolling in, seemed to act pretty quickly in terms of how quickly they got there to investigate and then to also actually release a response or a findings report within what seemed like maybe 3.5 weeks or so.
Yeah. Well, they did respond. That's good. I mean, in the best of all possible worlds, you would want these regulatory agencies to be more proactive and not have to wait for, in the case of Hoosick Falls, a guy to do his own private water test because his dad just died. And in this case, a woman who lives next to this manure lagoon that says, hey, they're breaking all the rules. So why couldn't the regulatory agencies be the ones initiating these things instead of local people in an ideal world? But they have limited resources too. They can't be everywhere all the time. So maybe it has to work this way.
But to that end, I mean, one of the things that we hear quite a bit is the staffing complaint, and while that's understandable, at some point, it doesn't really seem like that's going to be a valid excuse for some of the folks who feel like their local water sources or their local communities are being turned into dumping grounds or refuse locations.
Right. Well, that's right. I mean, that's why I think it's really important to get the reporting out there and get people aware of what these issues are, because it does matter. I mean, if there are, for example, PFAS in public water supplies anywhere in the Finger Lakes, we need to know about it right away.
Right.
And so what steps does the public have to take to find out whether they're there or not? And they very well may be there. I mean, one thing that came out in the survey that the DEC did was all of the airports, any good-sized airport, has had this firefighting foam that's really rich in this PFAS stuff, and it gets in the water supply very quickly, or at least in the groundwater quickly.
So one of the issues that you have been relentless in covering, Greenwich.
Yep.
This is one that, and we were talking about it right before we came on here. It's not the first environmental issue that people think about when they think environmental issue. They think about the landfills, they think about Crestwood, a lot of the ones that have gotten big headlines over the last few years. But this is equally or close to equally important, especially given what has recently transpired. So walk us through what's going on there.
Sure. Well, Greenwich is in Dresden, which is not, a booming metropolis, and there's not a lot of media there, and it was a case where the owners got in very early with campaign contributions to the governor, and they, bought a lobbyist who was very tied in with the administration, and they fast tracked the permitting of that, and they got, to an outsider, it looks like they sort of got away with a couple things. First of all, they got the DEC to say that there will be no significant environmental impact statement from the restarting of this. But in making that statement, the DEC excluded the coal ash landfill that the company has always used. They excluded that from consideration. Now, why was that excluded? I'm sure there are, very technical reasons that they can use to try to justify it, but it is hard to understand. The other thing that about that case is that the Clean Water Act requires power plants that are sucking lots of water out of a water body, a river or a lake or the ocean, right, to have screens to protect fish. It's required, and the DEC has basically given Greenwich 5 years to comply with that. But I reported on an internal Greenwich report that says, actually, we may have some real problems even hitting that 5-year deadline, because our intake pipe that is 7 feet in diameter extends into basically 12 feet of water, and it's not deep enough there to put many of the standard types of screening that are normally used. And even if they use other types of screening, there are all sorts of issues with the weeds and everything that grow up in the summertime. Filtering it is going to be really, really challenging. And this is all part of a report. So the bottom line there is, they may not even be able to hit the 2022 deadline for meeting the Clean Water Act. So when the DEC declares that there will be no environmental impact from the starting of this plant, what are they talking about? And why can't the courts step in and say, well, that's not really honoring what the state law says? Our state law says you have to do an environmental impact statement if there may be a significant environmental impact. Well, in this case, there clearly is, and there has been no environmental impact statement. And that's what the lawsuit is about. Now, Greenwich, they sort of took a victory lap late last year when an intermediate appellate court, five judges on that court unanimously agreed that the challenge, they threw out the challenge.
Right.
Now, the Sierra Club and the people that are bringing the challenge are going to try to have it reheard, and if they can't get it reheard by the Fourth Department, by this intermediate panel, then they want permission to go ahead and go to the Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in the state.
So that's brings us to an interesting place, because on one hand you see what looks like a good, solid, quick response from an environmental agency in the DEC, and then you have this other circumstance happening what would probably be like 40, 50 miles away, with drastically different outcome and a very different feel. How does the average listener or reader, seeing those two stories and headlines side by side, reconcile with that and sort of understand what's happening?
Well, I don't know how it strikes many people in the public, but it strikes me that when I see a company that has invested a lot in campaign contributions and lobbyists and things like that, and then gets fast-tracked, I get suspicious, and I wonder whether there's a connection there. Maybe other people in the public do too. That seems to me to be part of it. Do I have proof of that? No, I have no proof of that, but it seems like there's a connection, and I don't know whether the people in Connecticut who own the plant ultimately, whether they just want good government in New York, and that's why they're paying these big contributions. I don't know, but that seems to be a part of it.
So I want to talk a little more, since we got a couple extra minutes. Talk a little bit about the staffing dilemma for the DEC. As you cover all of these stories and broadly across the board, do you think we are getting to a point where the state's hand is sort of going to be forced in terms of putting a little extra manpower on the DEC to ensure that these issues, even though they're happening upstate, a lot of them spread downstate or come from downstate, that they're getting looked at properly or the right way?
That's a really good question, and it's probably worth doing some reporting on the whole history of what's happened to the staffing levels of, say, the water department at the DEC. Because I think with HABs and with PFAS now, that we're going to have to really up our game in terms of water testing, and what labs are certified to do the proper kind of water testing, because we're going to need a lot of water testing. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a good chance that if I look into it, that I'm going to come to the conclusion that we need to have much more staffing in the Department of Health and particularly the DEC.
Well, it's interesting because during last year's budget process, there was a lot of celebration by a lot of the environmental advocacy groups saying after that budget was adopted, well, this is a good thing. We've got $64 million embedded in the state budget to study HABs and to study certain bodies of water where this is happening. It seems to be putting communities in this strange position, and even some of the agencies that be responsible for oversight of, we're going to learn what the problem is, but we might not have the manpower to even deal with what the problem is or what might have to happen. What is that sort of putting the cart before the horse, so to speak?
I really don't know how to answer that. Obviously, the state has new very serious threats to water quality in the Finger Lakes, and not just in the Finger Lakes, but the whole statewide. And I think that with the HABs thing, we've got to do so much more on that. And I think PFAS is going to emerge as a really, really large issue. I think that I don't know that for a fact, but my gut tells me that it is going to really emerge.
Yeah, and we've had some of the groups in here, and that seems to be the consensus, especially as we get into obviously what would be HEB season coming into the summer and the dry season towards the end of summer. But that said, what are a couple of the environmental stories or environmental issues that you are watching and some of your readers might be able to sort of start thinking about now, because you might have a story or two up about them?
Well, I think, as we move into summertime, obviously it becomes HAB season. So what are the new developments this year? Last year there was a big step forward, partly or maybe even largely because of DEC initiative of getting local groups involved in monitoring. Seneca Lake was one of the first, but like last year, Cayuga made huge strides, and other Finger Lakes have made really big strides in terms of getting people who monitor their little sections of their lakes. And they take their iPhones out and they take a picture of it and they send it in and they give the location, and then people can analyze whether that looks suspicious enough to be tested. So what'll happen this year? I mean, last year there was a big move forward in terms of monitoring, and I think monitoring is continuing to increase. But I think now we need to see more labs be qualified to do testing, because like on Seneca Lake, there were more cases, and particularly more cases of HABs with high toxins. Mm-hmm. But when you look at the number of tests that were done, there were not really any more tests done. They were just coming back more positive. Mm-hmm. So I think we probably need to do a lot more testing. A few years ago, there was virtually no testing, and who knows what the HAB situation was back then. Right. We really do need to be testing for it, though, because it's something you do not want in your water, your drinking water.
So where can, obviously, shout out the web address, and then also where you are on social media so people can follow your awesome reporting?
Well, it's waterfrontonline.blog is where it is, and I do Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn and a few things like that. And of course, I'm tied in with Finger Lakes 1.
All right. Appreciate the time as always. I'm sure we'll be talking more about these and a lot of other unfortunate environmental stories. Thanks.
Very good.
All right. That's all the time we have for today. We'll be back next Sunday with another Sunday conversation. Thanks for listening, guys. See you next week. Thanks for making this podcast a part of your week. If you enjoy it, consider becoming a Patreon supporter. Membership begins at $5 per month and ensures that local journalism can grow. Don't worry, you'll never see a paywall on fingerlakes1.com. There won't be any of those intrusive pop-up ads either. Just news, sports, and weather delivered 24/7 to your smartphone, tablet, and desktop computer. Learn more by visiting patreon.com/FO1.